The one that interests me a lot was where you talked about the curb cuts, and I
Yes,
think it was
curb
a
cut
recent one,
phenomenon.
and texting as well. How those were both created for disabled people, but they benefit everybody.
Exactly. It's universal design, right? So when we think about like designing something to be accessible to disabled people, you're kind of designing for like a very small minority group. If you're trying to design for a deaf person or for a blind person or for a wheelchair user or an amputee, it can feel like you're designing for this really small group of people, and that's maybe a lot of money to spend for like to benefit this small group of people.
Hmm.
But the reality is what we've seen over time is what we thought of as an accessible design feature actually ends up being way more widely used by way more people, and a lot of whom would identify as able-bodied. So the cut in the curb, right, that slant in the sidewalk where you go to cross, was designed for people in wheelchairs or who use walkers. But now all of us who ride our bikes or pull a suitcase or are on a skateboard or pushing a baby stroller are really happy that curb cut is there, so we don't have to like pick it up and take it down the curb. And so what was an accessible design actually became a universal design, universally accessed and enjoyed by everybody. And text messaging was designed as an alternative to phone calls for the deaf community. But now I think the majority of us would probably say like we text more than we have phone calls.
Definitely.
And so it just has been true in history that when we design for accessibility, we actually design for everybody and everybody benefits, which is why it's just really good to push yourself to think creatively, to think outside the box of how could I help everybody? How can I build this app or this product or this environment to be used and accessed by everybody who exists in this world? And that includes disabled people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I didn't know either of those. And I know there's probably a million answers to this question, but are there some things off the top of your head that you can think of that need to be made more accessible for disabled people? Like what are
Definitely a
the
long
top
list.
ones? Yeah.
I'd say the biggest frustration for me, and I think a lot of other blind people, is how common touch screens are becoming, but they're not accessible. It is possible to make touch screens accessible. For example, I can use a smartphone. Pretty much all smartphones are touchscreen, and pretty much all of them are accessible to me, from whether it's whether it's a Google phone, whether it's a Samsung phone, whether it's an Apple phone. I can use all of those. They're touchscreen. But if I go to use a touchscreen microwave, not accessible. If I go to use a touchscreen with my credit card, not accessible. And so that's really frustrating, because the way I look at it and the way I try to help people understand it is that technology either has the ability to widen the gap or to close the gap. And so when you choose to make your technology accessible to the blind or deaf community, you're choosing to help close the gap in society between us. You're empowering us to be more independent, to be more capable, and to access more information and more opportunity. But when you don't design with accessibility in mind and you just choose to ignore an entire group of people, you widen that gap, because all of a sudden now I can't do something and I need to ask somebody for help. So I can't be independent. And so it really is so important to think about closing the gap instead of widening it.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about your phone being a touchscreen that's accessible for you, what parts of the technology make it accessible?
So there's different screen readers that are made by different companies. So for example, Android is called TalkBack, Samsung is Voice Assistant, Apple is VoiceOver. And so basically it's just in the settings, preloaded on the phone. You can go find accessibility features, you turn it on. You can even ask, like if you have an iPhone, you can ask Siri, turn VoiceOver on. And all of a sudden everything that's under my fingertip gets read aloud. So I'm not missing any information, and I can use every app except apps that don't design with accessibility in mind. So if an individual app creator has decided to not think about screen reader users, then it's usually not accessible. But all kind of Apple, Samsung, all of their built-in apps are fully accessible.
Yeah, and that sounds like something that could definitely be implemented into the touchscreens in the grocery store, the airport, and et cetera. I think that can be done.
Yeah.
And it's crazy that you mentioned that because it's things that you don't hear that often, and that definitely need to be brought to attention much more.
Mhm.
Like I feel like there's a huge lack of attention on making, when creating products to make them.
Accessible for disabled people, yeah.
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 And really shortening
And
the
I think
gap.
what's important to realize is that the disability community is the only minority group that anybody can join at any time, right? Like most people with disabilities aren't born disabled. Most people with disabilities either acquire their disability through an accident, which nobody plans to get in an accident,
Yeah.
or through illness, or through old age, the aging process. And so you don't know when you might be affected by the world not being accessible. And so it just makes sense to put effort into thinking about everybody and thinking about actually being inclusive. And I think you see a lot of conferences or panels where they talk about like diversity. And you'll see pretty much every minority group represented in one way or another, and disability is always left out. It's never there. And that's why people don't hear about it. That's why people don't hear anybody really talking that loudly about the need for accessible product and design, is because we're so often left off the conversation. We're left off the table. And that's why I make content. That's why I want to try to like get a microphone and yell as loud as I can to help people understand. And it's awesome to see how many more disabled content creators are out there sharing their stories and raising their voice and raising awareness, breaking stereotypes and misconceptions. But we still, as a community, we still have a long way to go before we really have, equal rights and equal opportunities.